So single-page apps are a really popular approach in terms of building applications. You have one API, it can serve a web app, it can serve a mobile app, it can serve a third-party API. It's kind of the dream, but the reality is that testing is not really simple because there's all these different components that you've got to get to test for an end-to-end test strategy. You need the single-page app, you need the API that serves the single-page app, you need the databases that serve the API, and you need the data in the databases for testing. So an end-to-end testing strategy needs to handle loading all of those components at the same time. It needs to coordinate the setup and the teardown of the application state across the components for the tests. And it needs to be flexible enough to accommodate for changes that are going to happen to components over time. This is one of the JavaScript fatigue images that I plucked off the internet. And does anyone recognize this one? What's this one? Backbone. It's ancient. We've all done Backbone in our previous life, and Require.js too, and they're all dead. Well, they're still alive somewhere. But anyway, the point is I want to talk about a testing strategy, and there are many different testing strategies. It's like, there's many ways to make an egg, well, unless you're a vegan, but there's many different ways to approach this. So strategy I had was two key technologies, Cucumber.js and Google Chrome's Puppeteer. So I'm going to talk about Cucumber. Who here's used Cucumber? Cool, so there's quite a few of you that have used it. So I'm going to give a quick run through, not cover every single thing, just a kind of what it does. So it's a behavior-driven development tool that allows you to describe an application's features in an English language and then get that to power automated tests. The description of the application's features run the tests, and it becomes a safety net to catch bugs and prevent regressions. And it also provides living documentation on how the app works to people that aren't developers who can read it and understand it. And that's a key important feature of Cucumber. Developers, they come and they go from projects and companies, and you really want something that someone can read it and go, I can read the code, but I'd rather just try and get a sense of what it's doing elsewhere. And that's what this documentation provides. So Cucumber in some steps. Step one, installing it. You can install it just like that, pass the capitalized D as a development dependency. Step two, create a folder in your app called features, and we will put Cucumber-related features, files, and folders in here. And then step three, meet with your product owner and talk about a feature you want to implement. And then talk about that perspective of the user using the feature. What would they do? How would they interact with the application? And write down some notes or put it on a whiteboard, whatever process works for you. And then once you've got those notes, you want to turn it into a feature file. So say we've got a feature called deleteUser.feature. What you have here is you give the name of the feature, you describe a business value that's going to accommodate who you are that's doing this, and what you want to do as an action. And then in the scenario, you then list out all the different steps in a given when then format, which is for Gherkin syntax parsing. So here's a good example that's quite pertinent. GDPR is exactly 1 month from now. So imagine you've got a scenario where you've got to implement deleting a user's data for a data compliance officer. You might describe it as this, and you sort of try and describe it in as much English language as possible. You really don't want to computerize it too much. You want to make sure that this is something that they engage with, they understand, and it makes sense. And then step 5, once we have a feature file like that and we've saved it in the features folder, you can just run npx Cucumber.js rather than say running node modules, bin, cucumber, You can just do that. And what it will do is it will scan for files in the features folder that have a .feature extension. It will execute them, and then it will print out results. What it will do is it will go step by step by step through your scenarios, trying to find out what the English language is. It will then scan your step definition files to see if it matches with this particular one, given I'm an admin. If it doesn't, what it will do is it will say, I couldn't find it, here's some code, stick it in a particular file in the features folder, and I'll be able to pick that up. I don't know if you're testing a web app or even an API through Cucumber. All I know is that you've written this line saying, I am an admin, and you might want to set up some data in the database, for example. And then what you can do is you can also put quotes in the text, and it will actually parse them out and turn them into variables, and it will also do it with numbers too. So here's an example. The user should no longer have any data in the system. The user, quote Sam, is then this string here. And the idea with that is that we can then put references in our Cucumber feature files that we can then pluck out and pass down into the JavaScript here. Step 6, create a step definitions folder inside the features folder. You then create a common steps.js as an example, put it in step definitions, and then that JavaScript that you saw earlier, just slot it in there, and Cucumber will automatically pick it up. And then you can start to write code for your step definitions that does things like, clicking a button in a web app, checking that the user is logged in, querying the database, making sure that there's a user in the system, for example. And then you go through red, green refactoring. So at first, everything's going to fail because you haven't written the application code. And then you write the application code, and then it passes, and then you've got your safety net. And now you can change it. You can do refactoring. You have that as an option. Now I'm going to talk about Puppeteer. Puppeteer is a Node.js library that provides a high-level API for controlling Google Chrome, or in the case of Linux, Chromium, via the DevTools protocol. It can run the web browser in either full mode, with application browser windows popping up in front of your face, or in headless mode if you're running it on a server, so there's no browser windows rendered. And you won't need to pass any of the funny Linux sort of XCCF, don't run a graphical user environment to render windows at all. It just works seamlessly. You can use this to do all sorts of things. You can use it to take screenshots of websites. You can create PDF files from web pages. It's much better than WKHTML to PDF for doing that. You can crawl a single page app and generate pre-rendered content. Maybe you're trying to build a ticket search engine and you notice that Ticketmaster and Viagogo all put all their listings via JavaScript rather than in the actual HTML because they're stopping people like yourselves. That's one strategy you can have to work around that. You can power web spiders that fill in forms automatically. And you can get a timeline trace of a website loading. When you're looking DevTools on Chrome and you're sort of analyzing your site, you can pull that data through Puppeteer and automate the process, which is really, really cool. So anyway, you can install it just like this, npm Puppeteer. What it will do is it will download Google Chrome or Chromium, and it will download a version that works with the library and works on your operating system as well. It's clever enough to know those details, so then it's a much simpler experience than if you're trying to set up Selenium, where you've got to have the right version of Java, you've got to have the jar file, you've got to tell the library that's connecting Selenium to your browser where everything lives. This is just much simpler. So here's a quick sample. You've got Puppeteer, require Puppeteer. You say in async await mode, you go await puppeteer.launch, which boots it up. Page await browser.new page, loads up a new page, and then you can say go to this URL, and then take a screenshot and save it at example.png, and then close. I'm done. And that's a nice simple example that's literally gone to a website, taken a screenshot, and then shut itself down. But you can use it as part of your testing strategy, and it can be used inside integration services like CircleCI. I haven't tried Travis yet, so I can't guarantee whether it works or not. It might do. But you can even use it in AWS Lambda functions. AWS Lambda functions have like a 50 meg limit. And it turns out you can build an image with Docker with Puppeteer's dependencies that it needs, and then you can serve that to Lambda, which is really, really cool. So making Cucumber.js and Puppeteer work together. The way I see it, it's quite ironic that Puppeteer is called Puppeteer, because in this case, the way I used it was more like this. Cucumber is actually going to control Puppeteer. It's going to handle telling it what to do. So Puppeteer is actually being puppet mastered. Anyway, so Puppeteer is loaded into Cucumber's world.js file, which is a file which contains a global context that's passed to all of the step definition files. And then that lives inside the features folder, and it gets loaded automatically when you run Cucumber. So here's an example here of the world.js file that I use for an app. So the bit of interest here, Puppeteer is require Puppeteer. I basically just put it here, and then that driver is accessible in my step definition files. So I don't have to try and require it in my common steps in different places. It's just there. And I have a few other things going on there, which I will talk about a bit later. And then here is where Cucumber does some other stuff to make sure that the world gets injected into step definitions. So how do we do the setup and teardown with both the single page app and the API? Which is an interesting question because you've got to combine them. So the case example here is a dashboard app I built many years ago, and I'm now reinventing from scratch, called DashQ. First version was built back in 2012 as a real-time web app with a framework called SocketStream, which I no longer maintain. The new version is being built as a single-page app and an API, React on the front end, Express, Mongo, Redis on the back end. And this time I wanted to develop it with behavior-driven development from scratch. So you've got the back-end repo, that's the API, the front-end repo's DashQ Web. So then I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the tests in a separate repo called DashQ Integration. And then what I was going to do was have the database API data here, front-end web app here, Cucumber tests, Puppeteer here at the top, all nicely contained in sort of their own domain. And what I then realized is, well, if I'm going to do this, I've got to find a way to get this to happen, where the API and the web can be accessed by the DashQ Integration repository. And to do that, there's a number of options that you can consider. You could go down the route of Git submodules. You could go down the route of Docker Compose with Docker images. But the strategy that I found that worked was NPM. So it turns out NPM is not just a package manager. You can use it to stitch together a couple of dependencies in order to achieve a larger goal. You can coordinate setup and teardown between those components. And I'm going to show you the package.json for the DashQ integration repo. So there's a lot here to digest, but I'm just going to bring your attention to this bit here. There's like 4 dependencies in the entire integration test suite: Cucumber, Puppeteer, and then the API and the web, which are private repos. And the beauty of this is I'm requiring them as node modules. And because I'm doing that, it means that I can actually point local copies of the web and API repos to my local machine with npm link. And that means that I don't have to have a scenario where I can't test a certain component. I can have all those components loaded in one place. So now when I create a new product feature, I can write the tests in Cucumber. I can then implement the feature in the single page app, and then implement it in the API when I need to drop down to that level. And then when I need to run the tests, I can coordinate the setup of all of those things in one place. And just to show you what I mean by that, so here in that same package.json file, there's a script section. So when I run the Cucumber tests, before I do that, I have this step called pretest. And pretest will use npm's explore command to go down into my web repo and say, can you run npm run build, but also run it with the node-m set to test, so you load the test configuration. And then it goes and does that. So my local copy's got it built pointing to the test API and what that endpoint is. Test then run. And then after I do that, post-test, I just pretty much run the same command as pretest. I just don't have node-m equals test. I say node-m development. I just want to get back to how it was, so I can just continue coding. And that's really nice. I've just orchestrated a couple of things running together there. And then, so how does Cucumber start up the web and API repos? Well, I use index.js in both of the repos, and they contain all the loading up code. So here's an example for the front end. It's really simple. It's just Express, which is wrapped by HTTP shutdown, which allows me to then close it programmatically after I've finished. It's just literally serving up a static folder. And then it's setting a host, which I need to reference in the Cucumber steps to be able to work out what URL I need to load in Puppeteer, and then exporting the server. Again, the API repo, a little bit more, but similar approach: Express, HTTP shutdown, wrapping it, and then again, an endpoint to point to for Cucumber to pick up. And then I load these in the world.js file from earlier. So if you look up here, if you look up here at the very top, constant API, constant web, those are actually loading them programmatically. I don't need to do anything more. That's it. They just handle themselves. And then when I need to do anything with them to access any more, I can scope them here. And later on, we'll see an example of me shutting them down later. So managing data in the databases. DashQ uses MongoDB and Mongoose, but I am considering PostgreSQL with a ORM called Objection.js, which is Node async await compliant and has a fantastic GraphQL plugin. You can literally add a whole GraphQL API in about 3 or 4 lines of code. It's really, really good. But remember, as I said before, whatever you're doing in terms of end-to-end tests, you need to be able to handle changes to those components over time. So I might be crazy enough to think of rewriting the database part, but hopefully the test suite's there to catch me and tell me how nuts I am. But anyway, so I was looking at this and going, okay, so Dashkin integration needs to talk to the API, needs to put data into the database in some way. How do I do it? And the way I figured it out was, well, I'm already doing it with the node modules. In the hooks.js file, which gets automatically loaded by Cucumber, there's a bit of code here at the very top. So here, I'm actually able to just go require API /models. All the Mongoose models are there. I'm not having to have Mongoose models living somewhere else that reference the config or anything. It's all just in one place. It's all there in the API, so I can just load it up. And that's really nice. When I need to do some cleanup before any tests run so that everything's in a nice clean state, I just call async await, user remove now. I might be able to run those in parallel. That's one optimization I can make. And then afterwards, I did actually notice that I forgot to put a space up there before Mongoose, but I will correct that afterwards. Anyway, so nitpicking. And then also, out of interest, just on a side note, afterwards, scope.browser was Puppeteer. In Puppeteer, I'm like setting a current page context. If there's any cookies, I want to wipe them because I want it to be like fresh page. I'm not closing the browser down. I'm just literally saying we're going to wipe your browser's memory. So it's still up and launched. I don't have to shut it down and launch it again. I can just open up a new browser window and it'll be like, hey, I'm new. And that's how it works. And then here is where HTTP shutdown allows me to go scope.api.shutdown, says it's going to shut down, web.shutdown, shut down, disconnect Mongoose from Redis so that there's no more process listeners, and that way Cucumber exits nicely and is like, yeah, everything's turned off, I'm good to shut down. So that's the hooks.js file. In terms of seeding data, the way that happens is part of the Cucumber feature scenarios. So here's an example where a given a valid user, Paul Jensen, already exists. It matches this step definition, and then what I actually do is I put my step definition code into little functions. And the reason I do that is because then it's really nice and clean to just write a couple of lines of code here, which later on I can repurpose in other ways. And to give you an example, just to show you, this is my step definitions file, and it's all just little functions that are semantically readable right next to the actual step lines from Cucumber's sort of saying, hey, you need this. And I just have it here, and it's really nice and simple to read, and that's really nice. The other benefit is that you can use Node's async await to combine step definitions for a single step. So the reason for doing this is, say you've got a Cucumber scenario login with an email address. There's 8 steps there, but there's 7 that I'm interested in from the second line down. And if you are doing any sort of testing you wanted to test from the very start, each of those steps has its own dedicated step function. If I wanted to repurpose that in every scenario, you've got to repeat those 7 lines every single scenario, and that just gets really, really verbose. I would say that it would make those feature files cumbersome. I've got a pun jar at work for this very reason. I have a bad habit. But anyway, instead what we can do is we can dry up our Cucumber scenarios. So what we can do is we can use async await to basically combine them. So here you've got these 7 particular steps to log in as a user. What I can do is I can just go, and I log in. And I just leave it at that. It's kind of assumes that I'm logging in as a person. And then what I do is, and I log in, looks at this particular step definition here. And here is a combination of about 7 different actions that are all queued together through async await. And they all run, and they do the whole login process. And I've just been able to express that in one line in the Cucumber file. If you actually notice the pattern here of visit homepage, click an item, go to page, it marries with what's actually happening there in the top 3 or 4 lines of the Cucumber feature scenario. It's literally just a mirror copy. But because of that, I can just express it as one line. And that makes the Cucumber feature files less verbose. That's the best way to keep everyone engaging with them as they start to write them and test the app, and then people have to read them and say, okay, does this still make sense? So anyway, in terms of selecting elements in the page to click, fill in and check that they're there, you can use CSS selectors in Puppeteer to do that. I have a nice large list of CSS selectors I'll show you in a bit, which is just nested in an object tree. In terms of XPath support, Puppeteer doesn't have it just yet, but they're actually introducing it in the next release, which is just 3 weeks away, which is great because it means you get to do some more powerful selections where you can actually look at an element. So I want to select based on the fact that it's got some inline text saying a particular phrase, which is much better than I have to remember what CSS selector it was. And here's an example here. So the selectors is a big object where it says selectors.links.signup or close your account, and I basically have all these selectors. That brittle, but we'll correct later. That's going to be my programming in 5 words tweet later on after this, I've just realized. But basically, this is how I'm currently getting the CSS selectors to marry with the Cucumber features through the step definitions. Here's an example. So I pick out the current page, scope context, current page.click, selectors.links, link is passed through, and that's the way I kind of get it all to glue together. So just to give you a quick demo, I'm going to quickly get out of this, and I'm going to just show you this running live in action. So it's going to take a few seconds to do a build. I should have probably got it just to skip anyway and had that pre-run. But it will take a few seconds whilst we can all contemplate the meaning of life and everything else. And then once it gets up there, in fact, I'll just make it a little bit. In fact, what I can do is I can move this here, and there we go, boom. And there it is. And if you can see there's Chrome just firing away, testing all these scenarios, and it's actually telling me you can see that little notification at the top, Chrome is being controlled by automated test software. Those tests are running here on this side. And this is all just automatic. This is the front-end app. It's hitting an API. It's all in one place. I don't have to hit anything else, and it can all just run. And it will run for the next couple of minutes. I'm just going to leave it running, and then we'll see it at the end. But yeah, so go to quick demo. There is a Circle CI recipe. For any of you who are wanting to use Puppeteer in your test environment and happen to be using Circle CI, I have published it. It's online here. If you search for Anaphenix, Puppeteer, Circle recipe, Circle CI recipe even, it's there, and that will work. It's not completely optimal. I'd like to get it into a little Docker image, but it's there. And it's available for you to use from today. It's public. I'll tweet about it later. In terms of testing browsers other than Google Chrome, if you are wanting to do that, so you're using a public site and you need to support multiple browsers, my recommendation is continue using Selenium, or you look at WebDriver.io in place of Puppeteer, because Puppeteer is purely for Google Chrome. And if you're using Cucumber to test things other than single-page apps and APIs, like maybe desktop apps, you can do that. It's really, really versatile. So give you an example, you can test Electron apps. GitHub have a library called Spectron, which is an Electron testing framework. It will actually boot up your Electron app so you can write tests and run them and do that. And if you want to learn more about it, there is a chapter on it in my book. That's my little plug in there. And the book is actually also in Mandarin Chinese, thanks to a guy called Godi Zhao, who's spent a couple of months translating it into Mandarin. My name is Paul Jensen. You can find me as Paul B. Jensen on Twitter or on GitHub. It's the same spelling. And that's it. Thank you very much.